Oh, yes, yes. Alan's going to quickly do an introduction.
First, a word from our sponsor.
Okay, grab a seat and let's get going. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming to FedTalks again. We're 1 year old tonight. Yay! Thanks to the regulars and for everyone else coming tonight. You probably don't realise this, but we operate on an oily rag, and it only works through the donation system. So please I encourage you to do that and to bring others with you to do the same next time. It's surprising how many little costs adds up each time we do it. So thanks for that. You can help spread the word about us through our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/FedTalks, and the web page is fedtalks.com.au. So great if you can help there. And you can get on our email list through one of those links or through Mike at the back table later, and we'll send you all the information you need to know. And buying tea and coffee and cake also helps us pay our bills.
Cake.
And biscuits. Okay, so on to tonight, climate change. It's about the future of this earth and the life as we know it, and I'm sure you probably all know as much about it as I do or more. What can we do to shift our change forward at a faster rate than it's going? That's what we're going to talk about tonight, and thanks to our two conversationalists, Professor Brendan Mackey from Griffith Climate Change Response Program, and in conversation with Mick O'Regan from up the road. And thanks to them, there's a bit of work that goes into having these conversations, so they don't just come here and turn up. So thanks for putting the thought into it and bringing this big topic to our little hall. Thank you.
Thank you. I should thank everyone for coming on such a beautiful night. Normally people are congratulated for coming when the weather's terrible, but we've had so much terrible weather that driving tonight with that, I don't know if it is full quite yet, but the moon was quite magnificent. I saw a swamp wallaby as I left my home, and I thought, wow, what a cool planet. What a nice place to be. But then I thought, to spice it up a bit, maybe I could do an introduction to Brendan that had a sort of news-limited flavour. I just thought, I know some of you, I have great suspicions about your political leanings, and so I thought maybe I should say, hello fellow climate change alarmists. Welcome to another opportunity to have confirmed all your weird, unnecessarily negative and histrionically argued views. Geez, it's not as if the world is at stake. Aha. So, to begin, as we should, I'd like to acknowledge with great respect that we are on Bundjalung country, and I want to acknowledge the leadership, past and present, of the Aboriginal custodians of this place, of which we are so lucky to be part. I also want to acknowledge that someone like Brendan Mackey, to lend his time and make the effort to come to visit us here in Federal, is a great thing. As Alan said, Brendan is a professor at Griffith University, and he's the director of that university's climate change response program. Brendan is very busy, so I'd like you to quickly acknowledge him just once again, because we do appreciate. One of the reasons that Brendan is so busy is that from November 30th to December 11th this year in Paris, there's going to be a United Nations Climate Change Conference. This is what they call the Conference of the Parties, and this is COP21. And the objective is to achieve a legally binding and universal agreement on climate change, which seems to be something, Brendan, that's been elusive to date. So to begin, could I just get you to give us a sense of what's going to happen in Paris and why is it important? We'll come back to Paris eventually, but just to set the scene, you're heading off to Paris in November with a whole hugely significant group of climate change scientists and stakeholders. What's going to go on there?
Well, we actually do have a legally binding international climate change agreement. It's called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's called a framework convention because the idea, and it was signed in 1992, the idea is that over time the governments of the world will have to negotiate specific legal instruments to help address the climate change problem. So we've actually been doing this now for 33 years. It's unbelievable, isn't it? And all the current agreements, such as the Kyoto Protocol, which is the best known instrument that was negotiated under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which goes by its acronym, UNFCCC, they all run out or expire in the year 2020. So the new agreement that people are talking about, which that meeting's being hosted by the French government in Paris, so it's being called the Paris COP, and it's going to be called the Paris Agreement. It's to determine what nations commit to do post-2020. Okay? And there's also going to be some what they call accelerated action, like what are they going to do between now and 2020? You know? So that's why it's considered such an important event, because in the absence of getting any agreement about what to do post 2020, that will mean there'll be no coordinated international action on climate change.
Right, now there's a whole raft of issues that immediately spring up. The diversity between rich and poor nations, the diversity between the major emitters and the people or the communities who are emitting much less. Let's just go to some broad issues first though. One of the objectives, I understand, is to get nations to agree to a commitment for a no greater than 2 degrees Celsius rise, and that commitment was made in the Mexican resort town of Cancun. Why is the 2 degree limit so important?
Okay, so the so-called 2 degree commitment, it's a statistic. It's a kind of scientific statistic. The IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which reviews the science about climate change and provides advice to governments about the science of climate change. The scientific recommendation is that global warming should be limited to be less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. So by 2 degrees we mean the average global surface temperature, is a statistic, should be less than 2 degrees what it was pre the Industrial Revolution. Right? And the reason for that is, the scientific assessments are that if we can limit it, if we can restrict warming to that indicator, then we'll avoid a lot of really bad stuff, basically. A lot of really bad shit most likely won't happen. A lot of the positive feedbacks that will make climate change really spin out of control, are much less likely to happen.
Okay, so on a practical level, at the moment, if we look at individual people, and again, I'll tread out on thin ice not to make a bad joke, but with statistics, but I'll have a go at it, that our current footprint per person is in the order of sort of 22 tonnes per year. Is that a figure that resonates with you?
The average per capita emissions for an Australian are about 24 tonnes of CO2 per year.
Okay. To meet the 2 degree limit, is it right that by 2050 that 22 tonnes will have to come down to between 2 and 3 tonnes?
Well, what we really... to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees, globally, fossil fuel emissions have to come down to zero by about 2080. Right? So everyone, no matter what country you're in, whether you're in India, China, Mexico or Australia, your per capita emission of fossil fuel nationally has to go to zero by about 2080. Right? So that's the challenge. The challenge is we have to go from currently about 9 billion tonnes of carbon per year, which is about 36 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide, to zero in about 60, 70 years' time.
Now this leads me immediately into what I don't sort of understand, that it's not the focus of our attention all the time, though I suppose with a country with so many coal mines, the answer to energy is often found by looking at coal. But the reality for Australia, the sort of elephant in the room for Australia, is fossil fuel and the fossil fuel industry, which I would contend That'll be them on the line now. They monitor everything. But
Well, the NSA does monitor.
Well, indeed. They know which of you are using briquettes. But the point I'm trying to make, which is I think is quite a serious point for us, a very serious point for us in Australia, is that if we have this abundance of the worst contributor to climate change, how do we overcome the reluctance of any government to disregard that potential income, knowing that the world is at stake?
That's right. It's a big challenge for Australia because we get at least 85% of our electricity from coal-fired power stations, and we get government gets a lot of income from mining royalties and export royalties. Queensland government, in particular, tens and tens of billions of dollars. So to talk about that asset becoming a liability, no one wants to know about that politically, and this is why we are so befuddled. Because when political parties do polling or when academics do polling for research, the numbers are really clear. Over 90% of Australians accept that climate change is happening, and over 80% believe it's due to humans burning fossil fuel. There's only about 4% of Australians, 4 to 6%, who you could classify to be, deniers, climate change science deniers. So there's overwhelming public support for action, but we're faced with this political roadblock of that we're a fossil fuel dependent country. And of course, coal seam gas is a fossil fuel, right? And we're digging that up as fast as we can.
Tell us about it.
And we're digging up. So coal seam gas is a climate change issue. It's a fossil fuel. It has to stay in the ground just as much as coal does. So other jurisdictions that aren't so fossil fuel dependent or who have been planning for the transition for longer, like the EU, European Union, and Sweden and other countries, it's not such a threat. Their mitigation targets are more in line with the kind of deep cuts in emissions we have to have in the coming decades. But they've been investing in alternative energy for decades now.
And indeed, and a friend of mine who knows more about this than me, in a conversation this afternoon, acknowledged that, say, West Germany, oops, there's my age, that Germany is a decade ahead of Australia in terms of the idea that you can have a new way of thinking about electrical generation, power storage, power distribution. The whole notion that Jeremy Rifkin has put forward about the third industrial revolution, turning every surface into a potential distribution, a collection and distribution point for solar energy. All of these things are happening in Europe, whereas we languish in a country absolutely full of sunshine, but sadly also full of coal. Is Australia's key problem that we simply don't have the political will to overcome a dependence on fossil-based fuel?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a lack of political will. I don't believe there's a lack of base support in the population, but that base support's yet to find voice.
Okay, so why not? I mean, my argument would be that the fossil fuel industry drowns out the debate, compromises and corrupts all political parties and throws so much money at the political scene that it's very difficult for someone arguing against them to be heard or to get a good standing.
Yes.
That'll do us for tonight. But because part of what I'd like to go on to, and I'm hoping people might want to discuss, is what do individuals and communities, how do we put pressure from each level that we're at to the decision-making level above us in that sense? Yeah. How do we put pressure on our households, our councils, our state governments, our federal governments? Because we in Australia seem to be at this perpetual bottleneck.
Well, there's at least three things that individuals can do, but all of them really have to be done at scale, and that requires collective action, and we need systemic change. So hence there's a need for collaboration and cooperation. But clearly a very simple thing that everyone can do is use their vote, but not quietly, be more public about who you're voting for and why, and, you know, write letters to all your elected representatives, you know, well ahead of elections, join political parties, you know, try and influence what their policies are, but yet let your voice be known politically through writing to your elected leaders. I mean, this actually does have an impact when it's done, particularly at scale in certain electorates which are or have become swinging electorates, like a few we could name. I think and we don't do enough of that in Australia. I think that, you know, culturally we're too disengaged from that kind of political process engagement. The second most powerful thing individuals can do is look at where they spend their money, particularly any money they have to invest, and for more and more Australians, that includes their superannuation funds. So, you know, 350.org, the divestment campaign run by 350.org, I think is one of the most important climate change campaigns there is at the moment. I note that The Guardian has gotten behind it as well. And the reason why it's so important is because, you know, the fossil fuel industry will collapse under its own weight once enough capital is withdrawn from it and shifted to renewables, and the cost of renewables comes down. I mean, a couple of years ago now, I was talking to an engineer for Rio Tinto up at Weipa, and I put it to him straight. I said, could you make aluminium in Australia with solar energy, with electricity from solar energy, with today's technology? He said, yes. We could build a parabolic dish to concentrate the sunlight, and we'd convert the sunlight into ammonia, NH3, which we can store and burn at industrial temperatures. We could do it now. And I said, why don't you do it? And he said, well, the cost of electricity from Queensland coal-fired power generators is just so damn cheap. Partly, of course, it's subsidised by us. I mean, we cross-subsidise it. So if we were to withdraw all the public subsidies, cross-subsidies, and really have a successful divestment campaign at scale, which I think is happening, then, you know, that would make a huge difference.
Right. There is one line of thought, and I'm interested in your reaction to it. The first time I was exposed to it was in Paul Gilding's book I think it's called The Great Dislocation. Thank you, The Great Disruption. And Paul Gilding uses the analogy of the Second World War and the initial reluctance of the US to join the war and the various arguments in the States, pro and con the idea of joining it. Then, of course, Pearl Harbor happened. And the example that he gives is that, I don't know if overnight's the right phrase, but immediately this massive private vehicle construction industry was just directed at the war effort. That there was this, you know, extraordinary mass mobilisation, both of personnel and infrastructure, to get a specific result. And Paul Gilding, I think, puts the argument that what has to happen with climate change is that the tangible effects have to become so severe as to be the precipitating factor in shifting mass consciousness. But until that happens, we won't ever achieve the necessary effort. Do you subscribe to that?
No, and that's I think that is a recipe for disaster. You see, because if we keep burning, if you look at the reports you see in the paper, if you dig down, you know, I mentioned the IPCC reports. If you look at them, they have all these projections from the climate change models that normally project to the year 2100, right? And they look pretty grim. You know, business as usual takes us way past 2 degrees. It takes us to between 3 and 5 degrees by 2100. But what happens after 2100, right? Like, time doesn't stop after 2100. So I went back and asked a colleague of mine at University of Tasmania, Nathan Bindoff, who's an IPCC climate change model. And I said, well, you know, what happens when you run the models forward? Well, by the end of 2200, it's up to plus 12, okay? And there's more than enough coal and gas and unconventional oil in the ground to take us there. So saying we'll just sit back and wait for the really bad stuff to happen, you know, so that we're really hurting, and then we'll all do something. I don't think that's not going to be particularly helpful. And I don't think the war analogy is really good. In fact, I think it's a distraction. I think it's wrong to say we're at war, because that implies there's an enemy and we can defeat them. And actually, well, except we're all implicated in it, you know. I mean, you know, I drove here in a car, I burnt fossil fuel, I power my house with fossil fuel. I won't be rowing to Paris, right?
No.
I'll be flying in a big jet.
Though it would be a great news story if you did, but anyway.
But I'd have to leave.
On your bike, boyo.
Nice talking to you, you know, I'm off. So it's something we're all implicated in,
Yep.
and we're using, you know, the wealthy countries, 2/3 of the additional fossil fuel emissions of the atmosphere are due to the fossil fuel burnt by, you know, wealthy countries like us.
Which does I want to go.
But my point is the enemies. We do have a group of vested interest, a fossil fuel industry, who are actively. We know this. It's a fact. It's on the record. Actively, you know, politically interfering to muddy the waters about the science and to stop good things from happening.
Sure.
So if you like, there is an enemy, but writ large, the enemy's us. I mean, we're the ones. That's why the changes have to be systemic.
Indeed, and while I happily step back from the Paul Gilding analysis, I am interested by the notion of that there not being an enemy in this sense that I think Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, possibly other people, I'm not sure, but they did a whole series of analyses on the scientific group who gave the advice that helped the tobacco industry stave off the connection with lung cancer, also featured in the fermenting of credible denial in the case of climate change. So to me, in a sense, there is an enemy. There's an enemy of people who, through misinformation and unjust priorities, are shifting the likelihood of an outcome further and further into the future. So it seems to me there's a war of sorts going on to wrest control of the public debate away from people whose only interest in the debate is to discredit it.
Yeah, but that's life. I mean, that's politics. There'll always be politics. You know, I don't think that there's always going to be vested interest and there's always going to be politics. So I don't think, I can't ever see us getting to the point where we go beyond, you know, where there's no history.
Right.
You know, where there's no politics, where there's no vested interest.
Well, I bring this up because one of the things that you keep coming up against...
We're not going to go to some green nirvana where everyone goes, okay...
No, we're here.
The people of Earth are going to work as one to save the planet.
Yeah, that's right. If it all comes down to the green nirvana...
I
Federal
wish,
Hall is ground zero, okay?
That's right.
It doesn't get any greener than this.
Sadly.
Though I can hear that people at Nimbin are about to walk out. The idea then that as we go to this meeting, and as you say, there's always politics. There's always going to be different points of view.
Because there's always different interpretation of national
Indeed.
It's always traded off against national self-interest.
Right, indeed. And our national self-interest seems so embroidered with the profits that can come from the extractive industries and from fossil fuels, so that we have this, you know, perpetual backdrop that, in a sense, people can say we're going to cut off our own, we're going to disadvantage ourselves in the pursuit of a global agreement that other countries won't adhere to, so why should we? So I want it to take up that there'll always be politics. As we head towards November and Paris, in a practical way, how do those politics play out? If you go into negotiations in Paris, along with other people, what will you be aiming to achieve?
Well, I won't be going into the negotiations because it's an
you'll be advising people who'll be going into it?
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's an intergovernmental agreement. So it's an agreement between government. Yep. It's a nation state.
So tell me about the poker playing or tell us about the poker playing that goes on in an international forum like that.
Well, you know, I think it changes with each COP. You know, the whole thing blew up in Copenhagen a few years back. That's when everyone hoped we would get the basic framework of the post-20 agreement in place.
And that's largely seen as a failure.
Yes, and again there was there's a whole set of reasons why it failed. Some of which involve personalities, but mainly it was the vested interests and certain national self-interests, you know, prevailed. The basic problem we've got with the climate change problem is that we're trying to, well, climate change is happening now, Queensland's had 3 major, extreme weather events, in one season, and all of them late. I mean, it's not a coincidence. Climate change is happening now, but certainly the worst impacts are to come, and particularly if we go, beyond 2 degrees, etc. So, every government is trading off what they have to do now versus their responsibility to future generations. And what we're asking governments to do now is to give a lot of weight to the potential harm to future generations of our inaction, and to invest heavily now so that future generations, will suffer less harm and be better off. Governments do this all the time. They invest in infrastructure all the time, for this very reason. I mean, I always have to laugh, or cry is probably a better response, when every time there's a defence spending announcement, like just recently the government announced they were going to spend how much on new submarines? 100 billion on new submarines. And 12 months before they announced they were going to spend, 80 billion on a bunch, 36 fighter jets. Why not 30? But no one bats an eyelid. The Greens don't even bat an eyelid, right? Labor doesn't bat an eyelid. We happily invest $100 billion in some weaponry, on the off chance that it might deter someone, in the future from doing something. So we do this all the time, So why not? There's no reason why we don't do it for climate change. And internationally at the COPs, that's where the debate is at. I mean, most of the countries going to the COPs now are going in that kind of constructive frame. China, the big difference between Copenhagen and now is China. China has completely changed its position from Copenhagen. It's bringing in a national cap and trade scheme for carbon. It's putting a price on carbon nationally. It's making major commitments regarding mitigation reduction targets, etc., etc. So the EU is on board, has been on board.
So you have both the example of a command and control economy, in the PRC,
That's right.
which I imagine, in terms of the logistics of implementing those decisions, just makes it easier, because you don't have to put up with messy things like debate.
No, because China still has got politics and vested interests internally, and they have exactly the same kind of competitive internal battles going on.
Well, isn't that interesting? But they can still arrive at a globally significant carbon reduction aim, despite their own internal dynamics. How do you think Australia's position in the lead up to the Paris COP is being seen?
We've already been basically humiliated. There's a series of ongoing.
So things can only get worse.
The negotiations are continuous. The COPs are the main event each year, but there's an ongoing series every 3 months of intermediate negotiating cycles. And at the last kind of what they call technical meeting that was held at the UN, 7 countries, including the EU as an entity, put 36 questions to Australia, all of which basically heavily criticised our lack of ambition when it came to mitigation target, and basically saying deeply criticising what we're doing. So we've gone from being a leading light to being a pariah, basically. Us and Canada, us and Canada are out on way out on the limb compared to everyone else. We're a real outlier now.
Okay. Now, I'm going to go to questions in a minute. I think we can keep this fairly relaxed. I do want to, before we do that though, ask you on a positive note. To your knowledge, Brendan, are there communities or collections of communities, either in Europe or in other places, that have, through their combined efforts to go off-grid, to generate and store their own sources of electrical power, and then whatever surplus they have, to give that to people within their communities who may not have the physical infrastructure or the money to pay for it? Are there examples of communities that are showing what life post-reliance on central dirty energy are like?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I do know there's a lot of examples at different levels of government and different levels of kind of community where there's fantastic things happening in terms of kind of bottom-up action on mitigation. And the state of California in the USA is a really good example at the moment. They've enacted some really powerful legislation at the state level, specifically on mitigation, which has required every municipality and every city within the state to basically dramatically, really systemically and significantly change what they do in terms of transportation planning, land use planning, building design, etc., etc.
So you have a whole of government approach.
It's been a whole of government approach to that. Plus you've got a lot of examples of renewables, businesses and communities responding through small scale renewables. So actually there's a lot of interesting things happening in California in terms of governance and community action, and it's a virtuous circle. I mean, the reason why you've got the legislation is because you've got the an activated electorate who are asking for it, who then and it's been a Republican government. It was a Republican it was Schwarzenegger who brought it in. It was a Republican governor who brought it in, but there was just a strong, active, vocal, across the board political support for it. So it's become a virtuous cycle. And there's a push at the moment to have, as part of the Paris COP, municipalities and other levels of government to be able to formally table their
submission.
Submissions as to what their plans are, but what what their track record is and what they've achieved and what they're planning to do, just to help create a kind of bottom up, sense of action. Because when you think about it, if we do get the agreement and the nations all buy into it, if nothing happens on the ground, then it's it still has to be implemented, right? And who's going to implement it? Well, it's going to be implemented. It has to be implemented on the ground up.
So,
right?
So we really are back to think globally, act locally. Absolutely,
and the two, but you need the two because clearly, to implement the global agreement, you need local action, and to get the global agreement, you need local action. To prove that A, it can be done, and B, the public support is there for it. But the local action needs a global agreement. I mean, we've seen this with coal seam gas here, right? We get a decision in favour of the protesters, and then a judge overturns it. There's a judicial, decision that overturns it. So, to overturn that, there's going to have to be new legislation, right? So, and especially when it comes to mitigating greenhouse gases, the cruel, harsh fact is that the good citizens of federal and Northern Rivers and New South Wales and Australia could, have the best mitigation reduction programs on earth, but if China doesn't budge, it won't matter. I mean, this is the mitigation problem has to be solved collectively and globally. So there's a really interesting, dynamic there.
Because there's
the
also
global needs a local, but the local needs a global, or our local efforts will just be overrun.
It's going to be big on a t-shirt. The idea though that there's I might get these acronyms wrong, but I think the BRIC countries, which is
so Brazil,
Russia, India and China. But then there's also the MINT countries.
The MINT countries, so you've all heard
the
of
next tier.
Yeah, they're the next tier. They're the currently industrialising nations.
Right.
So the next wave of mega development.
Yep. I mean, one of them would be Indonesia, I imagine.
It's Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey.
Right. Okay.
So all emissions in the USA are peaking, and in the US and in
is that
the
because
EU,
because demand has peaked? That we're getting into an environment in the mature, developed Western economies where demand isn't growing at the same rate.
They're sending all their manufacturing offshore.
Indeed, and so they're offshoring all their problems.
Yeah.
And so at this other level, as the Parisian talks deal with trying to work out these complex arrangements, the countries are at such different stages of their economic cycle, aren't they?
Yeah. So so up until now, as I said, 2/3 of the additional greenhouse gas emissions of the atmosphere are due to OECD countries, if you like, or the
developed West.
Developed West. Yep. Going forward, it's more and more going to be BRIC and Mint countries. So the principle that's being promoted at Paris is applicable to all, is the phrase, which means that we have to have emission reduction targets from everyone.
Which throws up big questions of justice.
It does, that's right. So, which is really highlighted, if you recall I said earlier, to limit warming to 2 degrees, there's a finite amount of fossil fuel carbon we can burn. It's about 30 years worth of current annual emissions, to put it.
So if we continue at the same rate, in 30 years the cupboard's empty.
And then bang, the cupboard's empty.
Yep.
So the question is, who gets to use that carbon, right? So this is where the per capita, this is where the per capita issue comes into play. So from one ethical perspective is that, well, every human beings are equal, and if the Earth has got a limited capacity to absorb fossil fuel emissions, that capacity should be equally shared among the people of Earth. Like, why should I have more right to that absorptive capacity going forward than an African or an Indonesian? We should all have the same amount. Well, Australians currently emit 20 times the fossil fuel of an African a year, right? So this is where the kind of justice equity issue comes into it. If everyone agrees we have to reduce emissions to zero by about 2080, and there's a finite amount of carbon we can burn, who gets it? Is it going to be the EU and the USA, or in Australia? Or is it going to be Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria and Turkey?
They're big questions. The way we do this, and please, I'll apologise in advance if I miss you, but I will try to focus on people who put their hands up. If you just want to make a comment, that's really cool. Make it a succinct one. If you have a question, be similarly succinct, and if you can, give Brendan something that he's in a position to answer. Alan has a roving mic. If you're up the front and have a loud voice, risk it. If you want a mic, let me know. Chris Sanderson had his hand up first, so in the front row.
Thanks.
Hello? Someone tell me the time.
You here? There we are. Coming back to that CSIRO study that showed 80% of Australians believe that climate change is real and that we're causing it. Interesting when you compare that with the votes at the last election, which is about 50-50 or close to it. That would seem to indicate that there's a gap between the 50 and the 80. In other words, 30% somehow didn't put climate change high enough in their criteria for choosing who should govern this country. And I wondered if you had any knowledge of any research which has been done to try and close that gap between now and the next election, because in the end, either we have a revolution or we have to convince an awful lot of voters to vote for the party that is going to deal with climate change.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. So you're right, there is a gap, and it's not just a CSIRO survey. There's a psychologist at Griffith University, Joe Ressa. His work is worth looking up as well. But the numbers end up pretty similar. It's at least 85%, about 85% of Australian adults who, accept what the science is saying about climate change and burning fossil fuel. And I've talked to all those guys a lot, and they do intend to they've recognised that gap, and in surveys going forward they're going to try and fill it. But in talking to them, the conclusion that I've come to is, and I know that I think a lot of national governments and bureaucrats have this view as well. Yes, it's real, it's important, but it's not something we have to address now. They, as you say, they put other problems. They give other problems a higher priority, and how we change that is very interesting. I think how we change it is to get people to understand it's not either or. That there are, and we're used to doing this as human beings. We're used to dealing with multiple problems in parallel, Parents do this all the time, you know. We do it with our work all the time. You know, we don't have the luxury in our normal life of, you know, being able to neatly stack up problems and prioritise them and deal with them sequentially. So, you know, the problem with climate change is it is the great disruptor, because it makes every other problem we've got worse. Every other problem you can think of: food security, water security, you know, global security, whatever problem you can think of, climate change will make it worse. So getting people to understand that making it a priority doesn't mean we care less about other problems, I think will be part of it.
Just on that, the current wave of migration from North Africa into southern Europe, as I read the other day, just the sheer numbers of people, thousands and thousands of people getting into these boats. Negatively, I thought to myself, when climate change really impacts in a very severe way, that sort of scenario of thousands of people trying to leave ravaged countries will become commonplace. Do you see that as a possibility?
Well, you know, in broad terms, yes. I mean, people always move for... There are multiple factors that affect why someone will will move from where they live. Often they have no choice, you know, due to war or lack of employment or local environmental degradation. All those half a dozen factors always, you know, interact. Climate change makes all of them worse. And the worse a region is hit by climate change, the more exacerbated all those factors will be. There's probably only going to be, there will be specific instances where climate change is the main driver. Right?
Which will be interesting, because I understand from one of your papers that a citizen of Kiribati tried to take a claim to the New Zealand Supreme Court to seek refugee status on the basis of climate change.
That's right.
And they said it wasn't justiciable. They couldn't decide on it.
Which is a technical thing. It
right,
wasn't
but they didn't have to go into the argument because of a technicality.
Yeah. So we certainly, you know, the coastal zone is highly vulnerable, and you know, we're already seeing movements of people. I mean, Papua New Guinea has already moved villages, right, due to sea level rise. There's an island off the north of Papua New Guinea where they've moved the villages moved, you know, on land, and the region is already, you know, preparing. And some of the smaller island nation states like Kiribati and Tuvalu, I mean, they've been in negotiation with the Australian government for 20 years about this, and the Australian government's position, which is never made public, but, you know, and it's kind of the bureaucrat's position as well, is that Australia can, you know, I mean, we take in how many migrants a year? 150,000 at the moment. You know, we can absorb in our immigration intake whatever climate refugees the Pacific generates. But, you know, it's under what conditions? The Australian government wants them to assimilate and become Australians. But Tuvalu doesn't want to abandon its statehood or its nationhood, right? So you know, these issues are at play, and as you say, in other parts of the world, which are already under extraordinary environmental and social and political stress, like sub-Saharan and northern Africa, you know, climate change will just make it worse and worse.
On that happy note, with the hand up at the back, and then the person there, and then you at the back. Yep, sorry.
Hi, my name's Peter Olsen. I wanted to thank you for your talk. Given that there's been at least 30 positive feedbacks that have developed over the last 8 years, and given that Arctic methane is at 400,000 year high, what about the unmentionable Arctic methane time bomb and the methane cloth rates? And given that there's a 40-year lag between the CO2 being released and having a global warming effect, isn't it true we're only having whatever effect we're having at the moment is from 1975 to 1980 emissions? And, you know, have we passed the point of no return? And what about in the 2014 IPCC report with the high emission scenario where they talk about up to 90% reduction in food production, 90% reduction in food production on the planet by 2100? So in order to, you know, get people on board, isn't it sort of more helpful to actually explain the sort of world that could lie ahead? I mean, the power went off the day before yesterday. That was really uncomfortable. And then you say, things could be uncomfortable in the future. Well, maybe that's like, the power's off for a couple of days. And what about the sensitivity of the 300 nuclear reactors to, little 1 or 2 metre sea level rise?
That's called a compound question.
No, specifically on the positive, what are called positive feedbacks, like it's well established that there are, natural phenomena that can or will, once the temperature passes a certain threshold, be activated and mobilised. That includes the methane deposits that are in the tundra and frozen methane at the bottom of the ocean. But, and I've looked at those really carefully and the science around them, and there aren't any, there really aren't any reliable estimates of their current stability or instability or how mobilised they are or aren't, or even what kind of range of temperatures are going to mobilise them. I would argue that the science is just still too poor to know. Now, if you know anything about science, that's not good news, because it means science is only valuable when you can put confidence intervals on things. It's plus or minus 20% or plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So, any kind of rational decision making means you would stay away from boundary conditions for as long as you can until the science says it's safer to go forward. And we're not doing that. So the global climate change models are incredible feats of science. I mean, really, they're one of the great productions of modern, or outputs of modern science. What they capture about, what they synthesise and integrate, what we know about the Earth system is quite extraordinary. But they're models and they're incomplete, and they're particularly incomplete in terms of these feedback mechanisms. Everyone knows they're there, but they're not known well enough to factor in. And the point you make about the high-end projections. So this is another. People tend to. A model will give you a mean result plus or minus, 30%. Well, the plus 30% is as likely to happen as the minus 30%. So from a risk management point of view, you'd always take the higher percentage and kind of manage against that. So we're not doing that. I mean, you're absolutely right. The science is not being translated into policy in a way that's consistent with even conventional risk management, which means you'd look for the kind of most plausible worst thing that could happen. I think you're absolutely right about getting people to understand what this planet could look like by 2100. And there's been a lot of work. I mean, that was part of what the IPCC were doing, talking about scenarios and things. But there's a lot of, I think, a kind of psychological issues with talking to people about 2100, because it just sounds like science fiction. It's actually not. It's only 80 years away. My mother's 90. She may well live to see it. She's very healthy. I'm not joking.
But the reality is, for a lot of people, it's in their lifetime now.
For a lot of people, it's now in their lifetime. So it's not science fiction. Yep. So I think we should be, we should be talking about it. But again, there's when you talk to, and it's interesting to talk to the NGOs. I mean, I think the NGOs are doing a fantastic job on this. 350.org is doing a great job, but they're not pussyfooting around at all. But the Australian NGOs, I think, are all doing a good job. ACF and them. But everyone's in a bind, because if you do try and scare people effectively by revealing to them what are plausible projections of what the planet will look like in 2100, they get a lot of negative. They get a lot of negative pushback. People turn off. So all their media advisors recommend that they should take a more positive framing and show people how you can get, what you can do and to give examples of best practice and how we can make a difference.
Parking will be easier.
So, there are these two streams of thought about just from a kind of public engagement campaigning point of view. And obviously, governments are not the slightest bit interested in scaring people about climate change. They're very happy to scare people, even though they use the strategy of fear a lot, with refugees and other things. Presumably that's why we're all happy to spend $100 billion on submarines that may or may not work.
Indeed.
Because we're potentially fearful of something. So why not? I mean, it's interesting how governments use fear, and when they don't use fear.
The gentleman with the hat.
Oh, hi, thank you.
That's right.
You mentioned that Australia and Canada are considered pariahs, but we have tiny populations, 20 million here and 30 million there. But whereas China and India have nearly half the world's population, 3,000 million, 3 billion, and China is like a communist military dictatorship and India is like a sort of chaotic, corrupt bureaucracy. What good is it for us as like a drop in the ocean when these other countries don't really have environmental regulations the way we know them?
Well, we're pariahs in the sense that we are actively now operating in the international negotiations as roadblocks, getting in the way of more positive agreements. That's the sense I meant it. It's that we were really being, we were punching above our weight in terms of having a positive influence on international negotiations. Now we're punching above our weight in terms of getting in the way of progressing the agreement.
But we must be seen in such, risible terms by other countries when a former Prime Minister came out and said it was the greatest moral challenge facing this generation, only to have that policy shelved to be replaced by a government who denied that there's a problem. I mean, we must just be regarded as buffoons.
Well, not really, because people
Understand
people
politics.
know
I know you
understand about politics.
Yeah.
But just getting back to our carbon footprint, it all depends on how you do the accounting. And currently, the international accounting rules for carbon emissions are that they're attributed to the country that burns them, not from where they're sourced. There are alternative accounting models where if Australia exports coal and makes money from it, therefore the emissions should be accounted to us. In which case, we're no longer 2% of global emissions. We're a lot bigger player.
Yep. So, sorry, Chris, this fellow's been waiting. Yep.
Oh, and also the other accounting change people are proposing is that the emissions associated with the stuff you consume, you've imported as well. Yep. So, there are ways of doing the accounting that would more realistically show what our global footprint is.
Right.
Hi, this sort of is similar to the question from the guy behind me, but it's about risk, and you've used 2 degrees a lot, and that gets bandied around a lot. But isn't 2 degrees too risky? And so shouldn't we be aiming for less than 2 degrees change?
Yeah, 2 degrees basically is the death warrant for Tuvalu and Kiribati. And that's why the small island nation states have refused to agree to 2 degrees. What happened in Copenhagen was not a legal agreement, right? Mm-hmm. It was because the small island states refused to agree to 2 degrees, and they're still not. So in the current draft of you can go online, UNFCCC website, there's a draft negotiating text, right? And everything that is not fully agreed, anything which any party disputes is put in square brackets. So it's meant to be like a 12-page document. It's currently like 90 pages because everything's got square bracketed and there's all the alternative interpretations. But, 1.5 degrees is littered through. So the small island nation states are still arguing for 1 degree. And scientifically, like if you look back over the last million years, atmospheric concentrations of CO2 never got above 280 parts per million. Right? And it's currently 400. So Jim Hansen, who you would have all heard of, who was NASA's chief scientist, like this guy was a serious scientist, seriously good. He says, well, based on his kind of, and he's done long-term modelling into the past and all this. He reckons 350 is the absolute maximum, which is where 350 comes from. We're at 400, 2 degrees you can go up to 450. So we're actually looking at being 450. For the last million years, it's never been over 280. So again, the small island nation states would agree with you absolutely that 2 degrees is half a degree too much, and it's just pushing us closer and closer to these boundaries with the feedbacks. It's just politics. 2 degrees, 2 degrees is still ahead of us. We're at 1 degree. So it's just pure politics why they agreed to 2 degrees, really.
And the most vulnerable are the least powerful.
They're yes, and they're the ones who have to date and in the future will be the least responsible for the problem.
And the least consulted. Other questions? Sir, with your hand up just there.
Thank you. Two questions, both probably fairly different, but one is if countries like Australia, don't really come to the table, and this continues, there's other countries like Australia, what sort of mechanisms do you see that the international community will be able to bring to bear on countries that are really not pulling the weight that they ought to?
Like an enforcement issue?
Yes, further down the line, if that's probably fairly clear. That's one question. The other question is much more of a local question, and that is, do you see, for example, in Byron Shire, I don't know where you live, but in Byron Shire with sea level rise, do you see that that we ought to be planning more than we are now, or other coastal communities, should we be planning more, way more than we are now, and should we be looking at a much worse scenario than we're given through the IPCC reports?
Yeah, so on the local question first, and the New South Wales government's actually done a good job here. They've given, they've funded University of New South Wales to run what are called regional climate change models, which are the global climate change models, as the name suggests, are very large scale and give you a general idea of what's happening around the planet. But Professor Pittman at UNSW has got a regional one which is kind of calibrated for New South Wales, and it gives much more accurate estimates for future change, at a local regional scale. So they're the estimates that people should be looking at. I think they're all online. The government's done quite a good job of making them available online. Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, local, because what we're talking about is adaptation, right? There's going to be these climate change impacts, and it's at the local government area where a lot of the need for adaptation is going to happen. And the way that has to be implemented is through local government planning, state guidelines and local government plans, so coastal zone plans and land use plans, etc. So I think, all the local governments are struggling with this at the moment. There's been those court cases up in this part of the world, about what the responsibility of local governments is in terms of, it's challenging private property rights. Mm-hmm. All of these things will continue to erupt, but when it comes to climate change adaptation, planning is really the key, and statutory planning is the key, because that's where you've got the ability to make these long-term changes in a kind of methodological, systematic way. In terms of, there was a bigger question too, which was
there was in enforceability.
Yeah, like all international agreements, it's legally binding on Australia because Australia chooses to be bound by the decisions of the COP. That's just a decision the countries have made when they ratify the committee, the treaty. But to date, the UNFCCC has not discussed or negotiated any
And this might be completely far-fetched, but just for the fun of it, is it imaginable on that sort of enforcement scenario that one day, because of the shift away from fossil fuels and the inherent dangers of the carbon release, that countries that have really shifted the way they generate and distribute power might stop, might say, okay, that's enough coal and gas being sold forever?
Sure, that can happen. These can become stranded assets.
Right.
Again, I think it depends upon the whole success of the success of the kind of divestment.
Right, and do you think that we will endure a whole series of less than adequate improvement technologies? The carbon, the scrubbing and the stuff they do at the moment to reduce the carbon content of emissions. Do you think that there's going to be this stepping approach that the industry desperately tries to maintain its commercial foothold in a world that no longer wants its product?
Yeah, and that's problematic, right? Because every dollar you invest in doing that, you're not investing in renewables. I mean, to me, this is the argument about one of the arguments in favour of gas. Natural gas is it's less. The argument is that natural gas is it's less emissive per unit energy than fossil fuel. Even if it was, let's say it is, right, it's still fossil fuel. Okay, so the argument is, let's use it as a transition fuel, right? But you pump all this capital into that, you're not pumping it into renewables. The sooner we put the investments in renewables, the sooner the switch happens.
So things like, I don't know the man's name, but the PayPal millionaire who's now developed the Tesla electric vehicle and has massively increased his capacity to produce batteries in order to get the volume to lower the unit price. It's that sort of initiative that we're going to have to see right throughout the world.
Yeah, that's right. But keep in mind that his batteries still need to be charged. So you can plug them into... if I plug them into my garage power, then it's coming from a coal-fired power station.
Sure. Right? So, but we need that virtuous integration that increasingly individuals and communities look to the source of their power, the distribution, all those elements. And that just one thing is that one of the things I took from the Rifkin analysis, the Third Industrial Revolution, is that the nodal nature of digital society in that sort of peer-to-peer, that provides a model for collection, storage and distribution that's away from the centre, the central authoritative model.
And it's called a smart grid. So the grid we currently have is designed to take energy from a very small number of large
Yep.
energy generators and distribute to a large number of outlets. And we need a smart grid that can take energy from a massive number of
Yeah, like nodes
generators
almost. Yeah.
and distribute it. But we don't have that grid system at the moment. So there's a problem meeting supply and demand.
Right.
So there needs to be part of the
Is that the sort of
investments in
stuff that
renewables.
Germany's doing, like that smart
Absolutely.
grid?
Yeah,
Yep,
yeah.
right.
So you need a lot of money. I mean, you know, part of the package has to be money invested in a smart grid.
Yeah, and Germany is interesting because my understanding again is that Angela Merkel has as one of her key advisors. She's a chemist, I think, by training, or she's a scientist by training, and so she has this attitude towards the information that she's receiving, which is completely different from, say, the what a lot of crap thing we have.
I think you're talking about. I think you're thinking about Margaret Thatcher. So
No,
because that's true about Margaret
Shoot,
Thatcher.
I understand that. Yeah, she was a chemist.
Margaret Thatcher was a chemist, and she was a chemist. She was a chemist. I don't know if she was ever a chemist, but she did have a chemistry degree. And when she was Prime Minister...
She was a reactionary.
That's good. Yeah.
I'm here every Thursday. Try the chicken.
So she was Prime Minister when the first IPC reports came out and when the 92 Framework Convention was being signed, and what the story in Great Britain, or whatever we call the UK these days, England. Little Britain.
Maybe not Little Britain.
I was hoping Scotland would leave and we could start calling it Little Britain. Was that, she could actually read the reports and the summary reports, and it made perfect sense because she said, radiator forcing, you learn that in chemistry. China, as I said, they've got, it's quite extraordinary to see the turnaround in Chinese policy and programs on climate change. And here's another kind of factoid, about 40% of elected Chinese representatives have a science or engineering degree. So again, they're not seeing it, they're seeing it as a practical problem rather than a political problem. We don't have that problem. My understanding, there's only one member of federal parliament that's got a science degree.
Brian. Yes, question there. Question at the front.
And he's
were you waiting? Yeah, question there, then Chris. The gentleman there with the third row back. Please, no enjoyment on your own. No, it's just, it'll come back. No, wrong. No, that gentleman there's been waiting. Sorry.
Hello. I think we're facing, the human race is facing something they've never faced before in human history. And in that way, it's a problem quite different to anything else. We've seen 2 world wars and the massive impact and destruction that had on the whole world, but this is something different again. So I think we've got to start acting locally, but thinking globally. So it's partly we've got to get in there and start doing things, but it is also a new consciousness, if you like, where we're thinking about the thing in global terms, what's happening with our neighbours, etc. And so this in the past, the enemy was coming from over the hill or from across the oceans, and you'd see them, and that was the war front or battlefront. And in the environment, there was a volcano erupting or whatever, or floods, and you dealt with those problems at that level. But this is something totally different. And I think this is the great challenge for the human race now. And so I think we have to start, changing our consciousness even about the way we're looking at these problems in the world. It was mentioned earlier on, in passing, that the Chinese have got the big problem, of pollution like every other country, but they're a massive industrial base providing goods to the rest of the world. But we can say, oh, that's their problem, but we're the ones buying these goods. So why is that? Why are we buying so many of their products and not producing the stuff ourselves? So I'm just sort of elaborating on the how we've got to start rethinking about how we live in the world. So I just, this is just my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Chris?
I'd like
while the microphone's moving, jump in.
respond to that. I mean, what I hear you saying is that we're faced with this broader challenge of how do we live sustainably on the planet. And I think that's very true. And I think it's really important that we understand climate change in that context. Right? So if let's say we were to find a source of energy that was carbon-free, universally available, anyone could kind of it's called solar energy. That's right, I forgot. Yeah. So let's say we make the shift, we create the new smart grids, etc., the Tesla cars and all of this, batteries, and we do it all. Have we solved? Have we achieved sustainability? Well, no, not if we're still consuming, like you're saying. Not if, because we'll still, if we're still doing all this stuff, still overfishing, overgrazing, overlogging, overconsuming, we haven't solved the problem, the challenge of living sustainably on the planet. We have no hope of doing that if we don't address the climate change problem, and the climate change problem is like currently the big manifestation of it. But I agree with you. It is part of this broader challenge we face of living sustainably on Earth.
Chris?
I've got a mic, but can you hear me? Thanks. Just coming back to what's going on in Europe and how it got to China is an interesting story. The guy who has been working with Merkel since about the year 2000 wrote a book on what Europe's doing, and they call it the Third Industrial Revolution. And Rifkin was invited to go to China, and he spent a couple of weeks talking to their chairman and vice chairman, and about 4 weeks after he left, the chairman ordered 500,000 copies of his book translated into Chinese, which has then been distributed to all the planners in the country. And that's the direction that they're going in. What's interesting about Australia is we have never been given what looks like a strategic plan to get from where we are now to where we need to go. And whilst ever the fossil fuel industry is controlling the policies, I don't think we'll ever get that plan. And so we're either going to have a revolution, or that 30% who voted last time are going to have to vote for the right party this time, or whoever's promising about the action on climate change.
There have been some attempts to give people, a technically and economically plausible alternative energy future for Australia. Zero Carbon Australia have done 2 plans now. Their latest one came out last year. They're worth reading if you haven't seen them. They're actually, they're very good plans, and they've been interestingly, the mainstream media has utterly ignored them. I mean, they've just been unable to get the coverage they've deserved. But from a technical and economic point of view, they've been excellent.
Interestingly, the work they have done over the last 5 to 6 years shows that we have the technology and the skills to implement exactly what they're doing in Europe. So we're already backing that up. But the difficulty is to get that into the public domain.
Yeah,
indeed. So,
hi, Mark Swivel's my name.
Mark.
A comment and a compound question, a nightmare. So, quick comment. It's interesting to hear about equity and justice talked about in the context of access to fossil fuels or the carbon reserves of the earth, when the same issue or principle could be applied to resources generally. That doesn't really seem to be the conversation we're having on the planet right now. So that's my comment. My compound question would be, first of all, the elephant in the room, or the python in the laundry, would appear to be uranium. And in this country in particular, if we were to keep the fossil fuels in the ground with a successful divestment, if you like, what are the odds that we would keep the vast uranium resources of this country in the ground as well? So, and then my final question to cheer us up is, what are your 3 reasons to be cheerful on this topic?
Okay, on the first one, the reason why that issue of who gets to burn the, if you like, there is a usable amount of carbon to stay within 2 degrees. In the context of the international negotiations, that's one of the key issues that will determine how that issue is resolved internationally. Will determine what kind of agreement we get. So I'm not saying that carbon should be used. It would be much better if we stop using carbon fossil fuel tomorrow. But just from a practical negotiating point of view, it's an issue that's on the table, and unless you resolve that, you're not going to get an agreement. In terms of uranium, it's very interesting. There's a bunch of Australian academics. This has come out of University of Adelaide, interestingly, who have written papers and got a lot of publicity about why Australia and the world must go nuclear, how this is the solution. Go talk to a nuclear physicist if you want to find out about the role they play. And or talk to people in the industry. Go talk to the International Atomic Energy Commission or the International Energy Commission and read their reports. It's a very more subdued view on the role of nuclear energy for a number of reasons. One is uranium's a finite resource. 2, and the industry knows this, and the academics who work in this area know it, they have not and can't see any solution to the waste problem. And so all this stuff's still hanging around in buckets of water, like it's a real problem. And there's talk about the next generation generators, right, which are meant to produce less waste. Well, the reason they produce less waste is because the plants themselves become more toxic, right? And the engineers don't like them because they don't know how they're going to be able to decommission them, because they only have a fixed life of 30, 40 years. And of course, the big problem is if you have the raw materials and the technology to make nuclear energy, you can make nuclear weapons of mass destruction. And the biggest threat we still face is actually nuclear war, right? We still have these however many thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at every major capital on the planet. So, the best estimates I've got, or the most reasonable estimates I've got, is if you were to dig up every bit of uranium for about 100 years, you could account for maybe 16 to 18% of total energy needs. So it's a high price to pay for what is essentially still a kind of, transitional, what effectively is a transitional energy in the longer course of things. So, you won't get any support from me on the nuclear argument. The last question was 3 reasons to be cheerful. One is, I think, three reasons to be cheerful.
Yeah, no. I'm struggling too.
One is I am by nature an optimist. There's one.
Okay.
Two is humans as a species, as all species, do have an incredible strong sense of survival, and I think, as our earlier audience member suggested, as threats become more clear and imminent, it does help society organise itself. And unfortunately, the data is getting clearer and clearer, with every passing year. So I think the pressure will ramp up. And I've already said I'm an optimist, and the other is we do have the technology, and we also kind of have the machinery of government and industry and the governance mechanisms there that can deliver us a solution. I mean, from a governance and technical point of view, it is feasible. It's not pie in the sky. And my optimism stems from my fundamental belief that, you know, there are more good people on this planet than evil people.
Indeed. And see, that brings us right back to where we began with the news limited view of this meeting, which we could have as leading professor tells bunch of greenies to cheer up about climate change. I think climate change is truly fascinating in the worst sense. It is such a difficult and complex issue to grapple with when the intrinsic parts can be so diabolically debated and changed and reassessed. So for your wonderful ability to take all that amorphous information and make it so digestible and fearsomely palatable, thank you very much, Brendan. It's been a really great pleasure. Thank you. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. I would particularly like to thank Noel, who's done all the sound and lights, Alan and the people from FedTalks who've organised it, and for the use of this lovely hall. It's a lovely stage to be on. I don't know what it's like from down there, but it's very nice from up here. Thank you. I'm not sure if Brendan is around for long, but I'm sure you can squeeze a couple of questions in over a cup of tea. Thank you and good night.
Good on you. Thanks. How was that?